Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another Trails of Cold Steel 1 discussion. This is kind of the intro to it. I decided I'm going to make this a separate thing, like the prologue is going to be its own thing, because in totality that was like an hour, and just, God, when I run my mouth, I can run my mouth. So, this is just an intro to let you know, once again, what this is to anyone that's coming across this. Maybe you didn't listen to the prologue one, and you're just listening to this and just coming across it. Well, this is just me doing a deep dive on the Trails of Cold Steel games, because I'm going through them yet again. This is me talking about Cold Steel 1. I've gone through, this is my fourth time playing through it, and currently at the time of me recording this, I'm on partway, I'm like the 60% mark of chapter 4 currently. But yeah, just me like deep diving, because I've done videos where I've talked about the Cold Steel games individually, but I decided I wanted to kind of do deeper dives. I took some notes while I was playing the games, and I just wanted, now that I had the context of the Sky games and the Crossbell game, well, the Zero and Azure in mind, now that I know the story of those, and now I have even more context to a lot of stuff in the Cold Steel games, so I just wanted to kind of, with that knowledge, and, because, even, my Cold Steel videos were, I only did, 2 videos about it, so I just want, I just want to go back and just, really, deep dive and talk about a lot of stuff I didn't talk about, while also treading over some stuff I probably did talk about before, but being a little more in depth. So just kind of giving you the lay of the lands. Once again, too, I am not going to spoil future stuff in the sense of this is me talking about chapter 1. I might make little slight references here and there to future chapters, but nothing big. These are just spoiler discussions for this particular chapter. So keep that in mind. I will the Sky games are well in the past. The Crossbell games, I'm still up in the air on how I'll handle that, because continuity-wise, they're happening parallel to these games, so some of the events in those haven't happened yet, but those games came out before the Cold Steel games, so it's still something I'm calling an audible on, so just to keep that in mind. But yeah, I just needed an outlet just to continue talking about these games, because I'm legitimately obsessed with them, and I just make and take every opportunity I have to talk about them in some shape or form. So I will also note, with this set of notes, the prologue was a little all over the place. This one's going to be a little all over the place too, but I have tried to structure my notes a little differently. I've got, main storyline events, then bonding / character events, so all the Class 7 stuff, and then some NPC stuff, and then I have, an Arabonia / Zumeria lore type of, section. So, if you look into the, well, you don't have to necessarily look in the description anymore, but, there's time codes included. So you can kind of skip around just to kind of listen to whatever piques your interest the most. But that's how I'm going to be dividing things going forward. I should also note, I've kind of changed it a little bit going forward, because there's a lot of this stuff that can overlap across those different categories. So just know this is going to be a little more all over the place, but it's going to be a little more structured than before, and it's going to get more and more structured as these continued, because I shifted how I took the notes going forward, so just kind of keeping that in mind. So without further ado, moving on to the main events of chapter 1. Okay, so first and foremost, this is chapter 1, unconventional studies, obviously with the context of, I'll go over it more as I go through my notes, but obviously reference to the Class 7 learning more about what, is a big part of their curriculum. But obviously, this is a very interesting introduction to Rean doing work for the student council. And I love that Sara kind of roped him into doing that, and Rean's just he mainly did it because it's oh, Towa, she's asking for my help, she's kind of, all right, fine, I'm gonna do it, he reluctantly accepts it. But I did like that Sara, and that you learn this more and more as it goes on, Sara seems like she's just stumbling her way through this, but everything is on purpose. She may just seem she's all over the place and weird, but it's no, there is meaning to her madness. Because she talked about it later on about Rean being the center of the group. Obviously, we get context later on of, him being special, his circumstances amongst anyone else. And like I said, we get context for that later on. Because a class like this has never existed before. So just the fact is that Sara ends up kind of pointing him in the right direction of just saying, kind of go with the flow of things, essentially. But I do like how that does ultimately like feed into like the field studies and everything, which, you know, once again, just kind of following the notes a little bit more. Obviously, like, you do quests and stuff like that, but you also, like, you're helping out around town, but you're also, like, investigating the schoolhouse, which you learn that the schoolhouse shifts and changes, and obviously this is unprecedented territory, because it's like, whoa, like, it's usually been a place that students will go to just to train and stuff, but now it's like, wait, the place is actually shifting now? That's never happened before. Because I think it's in this chapter they talk about it, like, the gargoyle that you defeat in the prologue, it always comes back after some point in time, so I think as we progress, I'll probably, like, have, there is definitely more context of why that's happening, because it's like, the nature of what the old schoolhouse is and what it represents and what it's meant to be, it hasn't been fully realized and hasn't been fully activated until now. Obviously, we'll go into the circumstances, because there's a big reason of like, well, why is it doing this now? It's never been a thing before. Why now? Well, once you get, we'll go into that spoiler territory discussion, obviously, when the time comes. Just in different parallel, too, just because it's like, this kind of blends into the field studies, but obviously with Trista, it's like, you know, you take the Sky Games because Estelle and Joshua are bracers, so them helping out, no surprise. Obviously, the support, the SSS, what they do is supposed to be in competition with bracers, so for them doing the same thing kind of comes as no surprise, but also your cops, so it kind of falls in that territory too, to like help people out, so, but this is for educational purposes, is why you're kind of doing what you're doing. But nevertheless, we find the groups, or Class 7 getting divided into two groups. Group A going to Celdic, that's Rean, Alisa, Elliot, and Laura. And Group B is going to Parm, Emma, Machias, Eustace, Fee, and Gaius, which, the interesting thing about Parm is actually been mentioned in the Sky Games before, in the Sky Games, during the, because it's at the southern tip, essentially, like, of Erebonia. It's on, like, one of the more southern sides of Erebonia. It's where, essentially, one of the, I'm blanking on the name, because I know the name on the Erebonia side of things, it has a different name, but on the liberal side of things, it has a specific name. But when the shutdown happened, Parm is one of those cities that was one of those small towns that was affected, because it was in that close enough proximity to Liberal, so that when, like, all 5 regions of Liberal got hit by the Gospel Plan and the Orbal shutdown, like, Parm got affected too. So that's just kind of like technically the second time Parm's got reference in this series as a whole. So this is also a big part of, like, Alisa and Rean clearing the air. Obviously, I love the whole thing of her trying to, you know, she found out, like, oh, like, she's like, right, you were helping with the student council because you don't have any club activities. And he's like, how does she know that I don't have any club activities? Because it's like, yeah, she was, the conversation comes up later on of, like, she was trying to find an opportune time to apologize. I think I have this later on my notes, but she was reaching out at different points in times, because I think it ties into her bonding event, which, like I said, we'll get to there. But also, like, she, like, during class, she tried to give him the answer, which he's like, oh yeah, you know, you did try to reach out because you tried to give me the answer. She's like, oh, obviously you didn't need it. Because granted, I'm sure that dialogue changes, like, if you get the answer wrong. Because she actually gives you the right answer, but obviously you get the extra AP if you actually get the answer right yourself. Because I think the answer was, like, wasn't it, like, it's in relation to Nord Highlands, but, like, Rean notices, he looks over and it's like, oh, she had wrote it on her book. And it's like, oh, I guess he didn't need my help. But the gesture wasn't, like, unnoticed, so. Obviously, it's just the interesting thing of them both, like, on pins and needles around each other, around this awkward thing, and also that they've both been just looking for an opportunity to apologize to each other, so. But obviously, like, a big thing, too, is learning the purpose of the field studies. Obviously, Rean learns from, because of what he was doing in Trista, the field studies allowed him to get to know the townspeople more and kind of understand his way around the town. And essentially, that's what they are doing in Celdic, and also what their Group B is doing in Parm, where it is a situation of, they all have, like, surface knowledge about Celdic, but by coming here, they have a better understanding about, like, how everything works with, like, the grand market and everything, and just, like, what purpose it serves. It's like, you know, obviously it comes up later on, the parallels of what, like, a lot of what they do, who they're being compared to with what they do, but I know I kind of butchered that. But yeah, it's just... It's an interesting thing. That is, you know, just learning, like, right, it isn't just busy work. There is kind of a Mr. Miyagi element to it. And Sara is very Mr. Miyagi, wax on, wax off, of, like, you don't realize, like, you think she's just doing some nonsense, but it's like, oh, there's actually a lesson to be learned here. It's just like, yeah, Rean ended up learning a lot more about Trista and the Academy by going around and doing those quests, those requests for the student council. One of the quests you do here in Celdic involves a bear claw. I think from my notes I was saying, like, it came from Liberl, because then I guess it gets shipped to, like, Heimdall, and then it ends up in Celdic for, like, a merchant named Flint. Which I put in my notes a reminder of, like, Orvid, because that's actually a thing, like, he made, like, Estelle and Joshua go to, like, out of their way for it. It's like, it was a whole cumbersome thing, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong, but... the bear claw, because the bear claw is native to Liberl, so you'd have to go through a whole thing just to get it here. So there's also the Orbal lamp quest, very similar to Estelle and Joshua had to do that. I think you get the extra AP if Estelle does it. Like, if you get Joshua to do it, it's fine, no problem. But, like, Estelle is kind of airheadish, so, like, her doing it and completing it, like, it's like, right, you pay attention, so you get more AP. Similar thing to this, granted, like, Rean doesn't get treated like the airhead Estelle does, but it's like, yeah, you put the code in, you get the extra AP in that regard. Something I took note of and I thought was kind of interesting is, like, obviously you notice it, like, when you go through the game a couple times, but it's fascinating that, well, it doesn't mean anything when you're going through the game multiple times and you're carrying, like, your status and stuff like that over, because everyone will carry over their S-crafts, but I do know that Laura is one of 2 characters that starts the games off with their S-craft. I won't reference the other character until, like, that time in the story, but it's like, one of the people, there is another person in Class 7 that starts off with their S-craft, which I think speaks volumes. I'm trying to think, like, does anyone in the previous games start off with their S-crafts? I don't think so. Like, I think everyone just, like, whether it's the, maybe Sara does? I mean, she's a more experienced one, so, I mean, there's party members you get, like, later on, like, maybe, like, I don't think Olivier did, but maybe, like, Aget when you got him. I think everyone in SSS, like, except for, like, your guest characters, like, why am I blinking? Dudley, for example. But, like, all of the SSS, like, they had to level up to get theirs. I think some are storyline related, if I remember. I don't remember, because I know some of the ones in this are storyline related. But, yeah, just interesting, and it just, once again, adds, like, fuel to, like, what Rean had brought up previously in a prologue of, like, how he believed Laura is probably one of the strongest students there. Like, he didn't think there was any student that could actually go toe-to-toe with her. Considering her dad being the Radiant Blade Master and just what that means in the grand scheme of things, kind of comes as no surprise. There was an interesting thing where you have to do a monster request that had to be handled by you because the provisional army wouldn't take it. Because that part of the land doesn't technically fall under the scope of what's important of them protecting. Like, it's like, yeah, it just happens to fall out of that radius. It's like, people are in need, and, like, it's just, it falls, I think, out of, like, technically, because you do find out, like, this area is the Croizon province, and it's under Duke Albarea's, Eustace's dad's, like, territory, but I think that kind of goes out of the territory, so it's like, why would we go above and beyond? Which is even crappier, because you learn about this more later on, but obviously there's no bracers. Like, we'll get into that more, but there's no bracers, so it's not like Celdic could call anyone else to do it. And it's like, if the provisional army's not going to do anything, like, you have to be the ones to take care of it. So I think that's an important thing to note, like, right, to realize, like, the provisional army is there to take care of stuff within what they deem necessary. So kind of setting up that tone of, like, right, it's not a guarantee that, like, yeah, it's not like this whole, like, selfless thing, like, you know, like, the army would probably roll through and just, the typical Imperial army, like, you know, be no problem, but it's like, the provisional army is just, they're more hoity-toity than everyone else, just because it's like, right, we serve, like, they're higher status than most people, so it's just, that's what that comes down to. So just the fact is they don't care at all. It's just kind of sucky. It's just kind of an eye-opening thing of like, right, like it's not like it's a far reach out of their territory. It's still kind of part of Celdic, but it's like just because it like extends a little out of their quote-unquote territory, they don't care about it. Like, you know, you find out about Marco and Heinz, the two merchants fighting over the spot. Obviously, like, you start leaning into like what's like the main plot about Duke Alberea handing out the permits. Usually, it doesn't happen where a situation where two merchants end up with the same spot. Like, usually, like, that's coordinated enough for that not to be an issue. You also learn about the increased taxes. I'm trying to think, like, maybe that comes up in the Burrow games. I feel like it comes up a little bit more about the governmental side of things in... I mean, because Crossbell's in that very, like, weird spot, you know, because they're trapped between the Republic and the Empire, so a lot of their governing laws, you got into that a little bit more because Crossbell has, like, a weird... I don't know if they ever really... Maybe they did, and I just don't know. Like, I don't know if they ever really got into the minutia of, like, that for the Burrow arc. Stuff like... Maybe, like, places like Bose and stuff like that, considering, like, Bose would be, like, the parallel to, like, Celdic, you know, so... But, obviously the merchant stalls getting destroyed. Heinz and Marco blaming each other. Obviously, once again, kind of going back to the Provisional Army about their duty to keep the status quo, only protecting what their ruling order deems to be. Then you had the whole, you know, investigating thing where the Provisional Army, like, slipped up because they end up knowing exactly what each of the merchants sold, even though it's like, wait, you said none of this was worth investigating, so how did you know what each merchant was selling? Like, you would have run into us because we were investigating, so if you were asking around, we would have bumped into you at some point in time, but we didn't. And that's all because of Elliot. We kind of, I think that's later on in my notes, but like, Elliot's quick thinking and stuff like that. And I love the line of like, oh yeah, like Laura being like, yeah, like, your quick thinking, like, is, yo, you could be quite the military strategist. I was like, haha, that's a funny line. An interesting line because, well, for many different reasons. Especially because, like, Elliot is probably amongst anyone in Class 7, Elliot's the least confident person. Like, he kind of, like, sells himself short a lot of times, you know? And I think it almost fits his personality, too, because, like, out of anyone, he's kind of, like, the main healer of the group. I mean, at least at this point in time, because he's the only, like, mage-type character you spent enough time with. Because, obviously, for me, like, structurally wise, like, I always have, like... Elliot's always, like, the mage person casting arts and stuff like that, and the healer. For me, Alisa is kind of always... Alisa, for me, is one of those in-between characters, like... Well, I use her for arts and stuff like that, but I also will use her for offense. Obviously, Rean and Laura are, like, two of my mains when it comes to, like, attacking my brute force characters. Obviously, none of that means anything for my fourth playthrough, because, like, my third playthrough, I was like, screw it. And I just, like, used a whole bunch of Shining Palms, and so almost all my characters are, like, level 99. Like, just naturally over the course of the game, like, it'd be hard to get there. Like, you'd have to grind a tremendous amount just to get to that. But, like, the average level you end up at any of these games without trying too hard would be like 60 something, like 65, 67, something along those lines. But like, I'm like level 99 with most of the characters just because I used those Shining Palms just to say, it was my third playthrough and I was like, you know, it just makes running through the game easier. But I am doing nightmare runs, so it's not like early on like, you can one-shot everything, but even later on it's still a thing of like, even being level 99, I mean, you'll take 2 shots, but other times it still will take a little bit more. It's not like I can insta-kill like every boss or something, even though I'm level 99. Probably if I was on like an easier mode, because like obviously like being on nightmare mode does affect not only the health but the stats in general of the enemies. Once again, going on a bit of a tangent. You have the run-in with the fake rangers, which I love that's kind of interesting. I think that's such an interesting thing with like the fake rangers, just because like the whole, what's his name, was it Johnny or Jonathan, like the drunk in the town, like I would have you never think that story would turn into what it is of like, oh yeah, why he's so depressed is because he lost his job and he loves it so much, and then it turns out like, oh, like it's a big crux of the story of like what that's all about, and it's like, oh yeah, so that was going on, like you just, because you can meet him pretty early on, he's just one of those NPCs just sitting about, and you just wouldn't know that the story would develop in that manner of like, right, that's why he's kind of like, he's not the drunk for no reason. It's like, yeah, he lost his job and it means the world to him. So the Provisional Army is who they work for. Obviously, Elliot heard that flute before the Guardian of the Forest attack, which makes sense that out of anyone who would pick up on that, Elliot would. Obviously, this battle, I might have talked about it later on in the notes or something like that, but I think the boss fight is also where Rean unlocks. What's the line? Because you don't get any of this text if you have your S-Craft already. It's jumping ahead a little, like 3 and 4, to my knowledge, like a lot of those story-based, like, oh, you get your S-Craft or something like that, which ends up being the case for most of the characters in this game. That's never, like I said, I think most S-Crafts, some in the earlier games were like story related, but like a lot of them, like you have to just level up. In this one, like every S-Craft, well, like I said, most of the S-Crafts are story related. So like this is where Rean gets he had an epiphany. That's where it's like, oh, like Rean had an epiphany. And a lot of these times I have to remember when stuff naturally unlocks because I am carrying over so much stuff. But we get our introduction to the Icy Maiden and the RPM as they show up to kind of deal with things in the aftermath. Obviously, I think it's interesting how Claire's perspective on things was she was actually kind of wish she didn't step in because she's like, right, I'm sure your teacher would want you to have basically found a way to resolve everything on your own because without us interfering, it's like, I'm sure a part of your study was like resolving it on your own. Like your teacher wanted to put you in a position where you'd have to figure it out on your own, which Sara immediately shows up and is like, yeah, I'm good, but I'm not that good. To know how things would turn out like that. Like this whole, like, she wasn't planning on it being like Sara was like, I planned this to be a learning experience, but I didn't go that far in knowing how everything kind of turns out. Obviously, Sara kind of suggests that the RMP had an idea about what's happening all along, which kind of like, oh, you overestimate my abilities, but it's like, it's just the fact is you happen to show up just then without warning. It's not like the RMP was in the area, so for you to have jumped on top of that, because people had been like talking Duke Alberea by being like, please lower the taxes. That is like a background thing that people were trying to reach out to him, like Otto, the Grand Market Manager. He actually was in Berea hard trying to talk to Duke Alberea, but there is an interesting thing of like Sara and Claire do know each other. It's like, oh, when was the last time we saw each other? About 6 months ago. And now, obviously, knowing the game, I'm like, without spoiling it currently, but I'm like, is that related to certain elements related to Sara? I can only assume that would be the context of why you would run into each other. Not unless it was something else that she was up to, not unless it was something she was up to 6 months ago related to the academy where they would run into each other. Because the RMP, obviously, they basically investigate anywhere with a railroad. So that's kind of like their whole point. So, I don't know. I think I know the reason why like her and Sara would meet, considering who Claire works for. So I'd assume it'd be those circumstances and what that means for Sara in the grand schemes. I'd assume that was the last circumstances they met, but I don't know. Maybe it is something like academy related, because I don't remember if that came up at this point in time, that Sara she was like the main teacher for like what was going to be the precursor for Class 7. So she was the one kind of run. So maybe it has some correlation in that department. I don't know. Sara does reference Claire got a report from that brother about trouble. You can have your assumptions about who that may be. Because I don't remember if I think it comes up in this conversation about, I think the Provisional Army referred to her as an Iron Blood dog or something like that. And you're like, right. So continuity-wise, well, video game-wise, this isn't the first time we've heard the term Iron Blood. Continuity-wise, it might be, like, at least in the confines of, like, the crossbow games in this. Timeline-wise, because I don't remember if the Iron Blood term came up. Obviously, like, Lecter's, like, running around in, Crossbow during the first game, but I don't think it's until 2 where the term Iron Blood comes up, so... Oh, I say 2, but I mean Azure. So, but I find it funny, like the whole like brother element, like of referring to him as like your brother. It's like I mean, I guess like they are his children, but it's like, well, spoilers, like, they're not actually blood related. So, like, it's so interesting because, like, they, you know, they never get referred to, like, they are, like, siblings, but it never really comes up like that, of, like, they never really get referred to as, like, because anytime, like, because they don't, I mean, because maybe at this point in time, Falcom hadn't worked out, like, how many other, like, Iron Bloods they wanted to be, because it's never, like, because Lecter's the only one that's mentioned, but, like, it does, there is talk about their, I don't even know if there's ever talk about there being others. He's an Iron Blood. That's kind of all it is. So it always makes you wonder, like, at what point did Falcom have stuff worked out, and which other which in other areas did they not have stuff already worked out or planned out? Because they kind of, like, have to retcon certain things, and they leave themselves open enough room where it's like, it's not necessarily a retcon. It's just more like, hey, we're filling in this gap of information. It's kind of like, technically, WandaVision episode 8, you know, where we get more about Wanda's past, kind of retcons certain elements of Age of Ultron, but it's more like, it adds more context of, like, yeah, like, you can take that and you can build upon it. So it's not technically retconning, it's a special type of retconning. In some cases, they've had to straight up retcon certain things, but still. Obviously, you learned that Sara had to rush and go help Group B, and then immediately come back and check on Group A because things were disastrous, because, well, Machias and Uses in the same group. Obviously, that was going to stir up problems. Everyone immediately was like, is that kind of a good idea? You know, but once again, there's a method to her madness. But obviously, fully understanding now the purpose of their field studies, learning about places you may be deployed to, because it is a military academy, but also it's about swift judgment and how to operate without order sometimes. Rean does notice that what they did has a very similar MO to Bracers, and that's kind of like the tie-in of, like, it's interesting because, like, obviously you had straight up Bracers, Estelle and Joshua. You had the SSS doing essentially Bracer work because they were in straight competition, because they needed to obviously get the cops, the CPD's reputation out of the toilet, because obviously people relied on the Bracer. So it's like, right. So it's just interesting that their curriculum will be structured in a way where they would be doing essentially work that would parallel. And I like that there ends up being a storyline reason why that is. I mean, it's a storyline reason even in the SSS. Obviously, Sara uses this opportunity, like, she's constantly, like, sleep and awake, just because she's trying to avoid answering those questions type of thing. But Sara does think, like, the fact is they ran into that monster, like an enemy of that magnitude, is like the Guardian of the Force. It's like, it's a harbinger of something bigger at play. And obviously, we get our introduction to our antagonist, but essentially our main antagonist, our mysterious, cloaked person in, like, the glasses perk. I don't think they gave their names at this point in time. A lot of the talk parallels certain conversations that happen in Azure. Essentially, it's like, oh, about taking down a tyrant. So, you know, kind of already, like, I don't know how many people who played Azure before, like, getting, like, who play the games in order, because it's always an interesting thing of, like, how, like, did people piece that together immediately, knowing that there was a direct correlation between, like, some of the stuff that goes down in Azure with what's happening here in Cold Steel, like, at the very beginning. Like, did people go, like, oh, is that what that is? Like, especially using the word tyrant, because it's a very specific word about taking a specific tyrant down here. So, oh, another important thing is, and, you know, I brought it up earlier, is that Rean opens up his family status. Didn't want to keep it secret from the people who would be a major part of his life, which the others are kind of like, wait, you can, I think it was Laura that's like, wait, you consider us a major part of your life? And Elisa's just like, I can't believe you can say stuff like that with a straight face. But, because now it adds more context of what Elliot was picking up in the prologue when Rean was like, hey, like, you know, let's just say I don't have a drop of noble blood in my veins. And so now we have more context of why he worded that way. I mean, to be fair, it's like, it's not like, and I'll talk about this in, you know, in the future, but not like Machias made it the most inviting place to admit, like, okay, my circumstances are complicated and weird, so, you know, I mean, who wants to talk about their family situation? Especially because Rean has his weird thing about his family, which you get more into later on, which just kind of like, he said himself, like, yeah, like, I owe a debt to my family, so, like, I kind of don't want to, like, be putting them out, like, too much. So that's why, like, I got to take everything I'm learning from this academy to show that my time was worth here, because I'm putting my family out a lot by coming to this academy, you know? So I thought that was such a fascinating development and interesting aspect to it. So next part, we're going to be moving into the bonding and character development. Obviously, the big thing, you have Alisa and Rean's, like, issues at this point in time, obviously before, like, your field study and everything. Same thing for Machias and Eustace. Granted, aside from that, like, Machias and Eustace, obviously, that's still an ongoing thing, but obviously I brought up earlier, Alisa and Rean buried the hatchet. But that still was a good chunk of the chapter where it's still kind of like, are they ever going to get be in a better place? Class 7 does have its own dormitory, which I'm like, I don't think they've ever, I'm trying to remember, I don't think it has ever explained what that dormitory was beforehand, like, ever. You know, I guess it was just like an extra dormitory, because the nobles have dormitory 1, the commoners have dormitory 2, and then there's this third dormitory, which I'm like, because it's an old building, so maybe, like, back in, because I think Thor's has had the whole noble and commoners thing for a while, so, like, why would they have a third? Maybe there's just been special case, like, I don't know, maybe it was for some, I just can't, I really don't know what that third dormitory could have been for. Like, what was it? Maybe it's, like, really, really old, and every once in a while they, like, shift stuff around just in case, like, they run out of places so people can stay there. Like, I don't know. Because it's not like, oh, it was built specifically for Class 7. It's like, no, it existed there beforehand. I mean, at least I believe so. I don't think there was any talks of it being a more recent building. So, if you know, let me know in the comments down below. Because I don't think there's ever specific enough, like, oh, like what that third dormitory represented. I feel like they talk about it, but I don't remember there being any talk about what purpose it served beforehand. Like I said, maybe just purely was an extra dormitory. Obviously, this is our first introduction to people in their clubs. We get Elliot joining the music club, which is like the wind orchestra club that instructor Mary, she looks over that. The art club and the cooking club, if I remember, she looks over all 3. Or is it just the music and cooking club? I think she looks over the art club too. Speaking of the art club, Gaius ends up joining that. You have little moments like, I want to say this is, I forgot when this was, like when you're exploring the school, you can run into Machias, and he won't go into the library just because Eustace is there. So, you meet a certain character, you don't know his name, but he shows you a trick, and Rean's usually pretty good, like he's got pretty good instincts, and it's like, that 50 Mira coin, which hand is it in? And it's like, oh, well, too bad. And he walks off with your coin, which is like, too late. But he did know you were going to the student council, to the student union building to talk to, like, Towa. So he's like, yeah, it's in this building. So what I think is an interesting little detail, if you're unaware, I've talked about this in a video, but in the deluxe edition of the game, it comes with the 50 Mira piece. I have it on my dresser. Yeah, I think I showcased it in a video, so I thought that was pretty neat. Because I don't typically get, like, deluxe editions of games and stuff like that. I only got it just because, like, I mean, maybe there's, like, a regular PS4 version, a non-deluxe edition or whatever of the first Trails of Codes. Because I got a deluxe edition of, like, 1 and 2, not of 3 or 4, though. I just have the base versions, I believe. But yeah, it comes, like, with some other stuff, but, like obviously that 50 Mira is pretty significant. It ends up being a very important tie between Rean and this other student. So, I just think that's kind of a nice, like, novelty, like, item to kind of get it. Because when I first got it, because it'd been so long, like, because before I actually played the game myself, I'd actually watch someone I'll shout out a YouTube channel called Imiru the Knight. I watched him play through the first 2 Cold Steel games years ago. That's how I became aware of this series, actually. And then, like, you know, so I already knew a lot of the story going into my first playthrough, because it had been a couple years, but I remembered it. 3 and 4 were the ones I went in partially blind. Well, 4 I went in entirely blind. 3, I saw, like, the prologue, and then I chose not to watch any more of that because I was like, screw it, I'm going to order the game right now because I need it. So, that's a whole thing. But, God, what was the whole reason why I was saying that? I was like, right. The point was, like, when I initially got the 50 mirror piece, I was like, what's this about? And I was like, oh, right. I remember the significance of it now. It took me a little while to remember, but it was like, yeah. Towa's doing work for Sara. It's kind of a thing we ended up finding out about. Like, obviously, like, Sara takes advantage of a lot of people, especially Towa, because Towa is so sweet and nice, and she's the most hardworking person. We spend a lot more time learning about that as it goes on, but Towa is, like, the most hardworking person. And, like, does Sara have no shame? Because she also probably knew, like, Rean would feel bad about it. It's like, I know Rean's personality enough to know he'll offer his help, so maybe that's why she was willing. But it's like... But to be fair, it seems like, yeah, she might be laxing off, which there is, but there's still probably, like, some element of her actually doing other work that she does have to focus on, that Towa taking some of that off her hands actually does help, besides her just taking the opportunity to drink and stuff like that, which she does a lot of. Obviously, I brought it up earlier about Rean going more with the flow. You know, next gust of wind can hit him, you know, so try out things in this place. You know, also the conversation that he might be searching for something, and that something seems to be a motivator for, like, why he showed up in the academy. It might be in my notes later, but when asked about, like, why he came to the academy in the first place, he said to find himself. He's like, right. It's just like, because everyone else is like, oh, that's kind of a pretty deep answer, but they weren't expecting that from him. So, because everyone's just kind of like, everyone has their reasons for going, and you learn more and more about what those respective reasons are as the game progresses. I think it is interesting that in the dormitories, speaking of them, everyone's rooms do reflect themselves, just kind of like in the crossbow game. Sadly, in this game, you can't modify the rooms. Like in the crossbow games, you can get some items to kind of add, and you can even unlock certain scenes when the more stuff you add to it. There's actually, like, scenes. Well, I think that's specifically, that might be a Zero thing, but I know it's definitely an Azure thing. So I think that's kind of an interesting little detail. But it's just nice, like, seeing, like, Rean and, I want to say Rean, Machias, and Laura are the only ones who, like, in the back of their, like, when we go into rooms, they have their respective weapons hanging on their back wall. But different people have different things, like, Elliot's got a whole bunch of violins up there. So I just thought that was an interesting thing. It's like I said, it's sad you can't modify it. I'm okay with that, but because I do like that they all individually put their own little touches to make the rooms, you know, theirs with certain items and stuff like that. You have Eustace kind of warning Rean not to, like, let people, like, to be careful who you give your time to, essentially, which is like, Rean's kind of like, oh, it seems like he was actually trying to warn me and try and be helpful. So, one of the bonding events you can get on your free day is Elliot. His sister sent, like, a whole bunch of stuff. He talks about his sister kind of being clingy. I think during this conversation, Rean kind of reveals that, oh yeah, I also have a sister too. You learn a little bit more about Elliot. Like I said, at this point, like, he actually wanted to go to a music school before Thor's. Said he wasn't serious, so he chose Thor instead. But there's definitely more to the story. Machias and Rean bond, you know, coffee and tea. It's just that Machias is all about tea. Machias is about coffee. Rean is about tea. And they switch off and kind of, you know, tasting. It's like, oh, Machias is like, tea, I could get used to this. And Rean's like, oh, coffee, I could get used to this. But the reason why Machias looks down upon tea is because he's always associated with the nobles. And so he saw Eustace sipping arrogantly, which Rean was like, how can you sip arrogantly? It's just like, once again, it's like Eustace does stuff to piss Machias off, but it's also like Machias looks at everything Eustace does and just kind of gets pissy about it, you know? So, I think maybe this was like a later bonding event with Laura. Maybe this might have been the afternoon bonding event. Yeah, you have Laura joining the swimming club. She's fast in water, and she brings up the fact that it's like, oh, if I'm a fish, my dad is a dolphin, which is like, well, I guess not too surprising with the Radiant Blade Master. Laura actually talks about like her dad told her to learn more about the sword. You have to take a step back from its shadow, like because you have to broaden your horizons. Like you want to master the sword, that's fine, but you have to broaden your horizons because there can be so much you can learn from the other facets of life. And I thought it was interesting because this kind of leads up to some of the stuff that goes down in Celdic that I didn't really talk about. Like I said, my notes are like, a lot of this stuff can overlap between like main story stuff or bonding stuff. Like I said, I do it a little differently going forward. So that's why that's why some of this is kind of back and forth. But Rean brings up being kind of a little envious of how dedicated she is. And obviously from the Celdic stuff, we learn about like Rean and how he, like his stance with his swordsmanship. Obviously, it was like, he made like an offhand remark about that, but like, she's like, you have a sword too, so you could do the same. And he's like, I guess you're right, forget I said anything. So like, he hadn't like, it's Rean's own insecurities kind of coming up at that point. You have Emma joining the literature club, which very, very interesting. Also, who's the head of the literature club? Dorothy. This is something I haven't talked about. It's fascinating when you go back and look through like the Trail series. They use a lot of the same NPC names in certain regards. Like it comes up later on. I'm going to talk about it. Like, I want to say it's in second chapter, Trails in the Sky second chapter. There's an NPC you meet named Ymir. That's where Rean is from, his hometown. I saw that because someone I was watching was playing it, and they were like, what, Ymir? Because it was someone who was familiar with the Cold Steel game, so they were taken back and like, that's so weird that's that name. But it's like, because they make even a joke about it in the Crop Zero, because Estelle and Joshua, spoilers to a certain extent, but obviously this has already kind of happened timeline-wise, sorry, but they meet Lloyd and Tio, which they find funny because Estelle's like, oh, like, my best friend's named Tio, and I know a Lloyd from the Fisherman's Guild. So, it is interesting, like, but it doesn't come up like that too often, but it's like, yeah, there's a Dorothy, granted her name's spelled differently. She wears glasses, though, but that Dorothy is the one that works with Niles, that works for the Liberal News. So, it's just interesting how that comes back up. I believe this is also in the afternoon, is Alisa's bonding event where Rean helps her clean up after lacrosse, but neither gets a chance at that point in time to clear the air. She even admits how like stubborn she is and how she missed a great opportunity. It's just kind of like, because even she realizes at that point, she's like, because I think at this point it had been like, what, 2 weeks they had been at the academy since like the prologue, and like she's just like, every opportunity she keeps wasting because she gets so stubborn, and just why it was such an issue for her is just like, she's just an awkward person. And I love that's why, like, the developments in relationships between her and Rean, like, why I like it so much, of just how, once again, I brought it up during the prologue, no other protagonist has ever found themselves, like, they've been in awkward situations. Estelle, like, had blushing, like, awkward situations, sure, but, like, neither her nor Lloyd necessarily found themselves in these exact circumstances. Makes Rean stand out that much more. Yes, it's like an anime trope or whatever, but it's one of those tropes I don't mind. But I know that it's like, yeah, it happens a lot, like anime and manga, so I know for some people it's like, oh, here's this trope. But it's just, I'm fine with it, like, you know, because I think that, I mean, maybe this is my misunderstanding, but I think that is part of, like, the Japanese humor. It seems a little, but I mean, every culture's, like, humor is different, on, like, yeah, like, stuff like that, like, oh, a guy fumbling and falling into a girl's boobs, yeah, like, that's a big thing in anime and manga. It happens in, you know, Japanese video games as well, because I think that's part of, like, the Japanese, like, sexuality and sexual stuff is used very much in, like, a humorous way in Japan. You know, I could be talking from ignorance. I'm just picking that up from, you know, my experience with a lot of, like, you know, Japanese media, like I said, anime, mangas, or, like, Japanese video games, so. There is some dialogue. Maybe this is also a bonding event, I don't remember, or was just a conversation with Towa, because you do have ones where, like, you do have bonding events with Towa, but you're also, like, sometimes it's just special scenes of, like, oh, just happen to talk to her. But she tells Rean that he's just as important to the academy like everyone else, even if you don't realize it yourself. Because she, you know, and because we see the early marks of like Rean's like weird insecurities and like the way he kind of doubts himself. She tells him to rest and kind of take breaks. Won't be able to do what you want when it comes to something important. Like if you like spend so much time like kind of beating yourself down, essentially. Rean and Alisa, obviously, I talked about this earlier about them trying to apologize to each other. Obviously, Laura, like in Celdic, I think it was during the monster extermination, she was like, yeah, make sure you don't hold back, and Rean was like, okay, let's all make sure we don't hold back, and Rean was like, oh, okay, like, what the hell are you saying that for, Laura? That's weird. Laura had talked about her reason coming to catch up to someone. I thought I knew who that person was because I thought it was her dad, but later context, it's actually one of her profile things that kind of explains this, but it's like, no, it's someone else in particular, which in a grand scheme of the Cold Steel games, it's an interesting person to look up to. I'll just kind of leave it at that. But I think it could still be her dad, but I think context from stuff later on makes it realize, like, it's a certain maiden that she looks up to that I'm like, oh, okay, like, that makes a lot of sense, too. You have Alisa looking for her independence. Not an ideal situation at home. But then we get into, you know, other points of Rean and his swordsmanship. He feels like he dirties the 8 leaves, which... this might be in my notes later, so I might save it, might not. Let me check that real quick. It's in later parts of my notes, so I'll wait. But Rean, like I said, feels like he dirties the 8 leaves. Couldn't amount to much in training, so Yoon Ka Fai his master ended up cutting his training short. Now, this will probably also be a point where I'll introduce something I didn't know about this, because this game does not reference it at all, because maybe Rean's just never met her. But there's a recurring character that you meet in the Sky games named Anelace. Obviously, she's a random NPC, not a random, but she's an NPC in the first game. She actually joins you on and off throughout 2, and then she's actually one of the main characters in 3rd. But what I think is interesting is, if you didn't notice, and because I remember commenting on this, was like, Anelace is Yu Kanfai's granddaughter. And I was like, that's so dope, because it never comes up about his family and stuff like that. Him, sure, but I'm like, maybe Rean's never met her, so, like, she's off doing her own training, so she's probably not around her grandfather a lot. Plus, he's, like, the hermit, so he moves around a lot, so... But I thought that was such an interesting little detail about, like, oh yeah, like, I was so fascinated. It was like, yeah, because that never comes up in these Cold Steel games about him having a granddaughter. Like, if it wasn't for the Sky games, you wouldn't know that information. Maybe it's just one of those supplementary things of just kind of like, oh, like, they have never circled back to Anelace yet, but maybe in the future, we might see her more in the future. Especially with her 8 leaves training and stuff like that. So, you know, but I just thought that was such a fascinating thing. But regardless... obviously Laura didn't take too kindly to Rean's comments, because for her it's like, right, whatever your issues are, that's something you have to figure out. She was disappointed though. She was like, right, one of the people I wanted to fight was you, and hearing you say that, it's like, oh, I guess you don't live quite up to my expectations. But Elliot and Alisa are talking, and they're nearby, and they're talking about, like, right, it seems like Rean's bottling stuff up. Like he wants to say something, but he stops himself. But interestingly enough, Elliot talks about the fact is that Alisa's doing the same thing, that she's bottling stuff up. Which she's like, yeah, I guess you're right. But the next day, Rean kind of apologizes to Laura. Obviously the conversation comes up of, do you actually like the way of the sword? And for Rean, it's like, because for him, it's like, everything I said was, you know, it was a strike against not on like any other practitioners, but also to himself and to his master. But to her, it's like, at the end of the day, like, you have to notice, like, it's more so like you talking down on, like, it's a disgrace to yourself, like, you know, not just your master and stuff like that. But that's also part of the thing of, like, Rean thinks about so many, it's like, right, it's a disgrace to my master, never, like, wants to think, like, oh, it's a disgrace to myself. He doesn't think of himself, and that becomes more and more apparent, too. But for Rean, it's not a fact of, like, whether he likes or dislikes the sword, it's just an inseparable part of himself, which Laura feels the same way. The only, as I was saying, like, the only shame he should be feeling is for belittling himself. Obviously, you had Alisa worried, trying to find a way to make up between the two, but they're like, oh, I didn't know me and Rean were, like, not friends anymore. It's like, no, we might have had a disagreement where we were good, but it's like, I guess Alisa went in panic mode because she's like, right, like, things between me and Rean got awkward, so I got to find a way to bridge the gap between these two, because obviously they can get along, but, so I thought that was so interesting. I also didn't talk about it either, but we had our first instance in this chapter 2 of when Rean went to the, because I happened to notice I had the note here, but it's in the wrong spot, so I'll go ahead and talk about it here. But Rean did have his first reaction to the old schoolhouse, which was interesting. This is the first instance of something that becomes a little more commonplace as the series progresses, of just, I'm trying to actually think, does that come up more in, like, the later games? Some extent in 3. I don't even remember if it comes up at all in 4. It definitely does in 1 and 2, but obviously let's focus on it here. Like, his like, there's like this, like, reaction, this, like he'll get this sensation, and obviously you get more visuals of it later on of what that looks like, but he had a reaction to the old schoolhouse. So, the first time they went in there post, I'm trying to remember, is that before? I think that's before he goes in there. I don't remember, because I was about to say, like, is that before the field study? It's like, no, that's definitely, like, I mean, yes, it's before the field study, but not the morning of the field study. It was like, no, it was like, I think before you go in there with Gaius and Elliot for the first floor. So, but yeah, that kind of ends the bonding event section.